Tuesday, war day. I was going to war today, getting their stuff done. So today I wanted to talk a bit about responsibility and freedom. I've had some different things come up in my life recently, and just understanding what does it mean when we have responsibility for our lives versus someone else having responsibility for our lives, and what does that do, right? So if you think about a child, uh, sorry, see my lipstick's on right. There's not much of it. If you think about a child, right? Hey, Pink and Blue, how are you? And as the parent, they have responsibility for that person, for that child's life. They take care of them. They provide food and shelter and clothing and education and all of that stuff. And as part of that, the child um, is, supposed to or should, right? Obey them in and live according to certain rules that the parents lay down for their benefit. But when the child becomes an adult, they take responsibility for their own life, for taking care of themselves, for providing for themselves, and they are no longer under their parents' rule or have to behave according to what the parent wishes. So that is the exchange, right? Now, of course, we're not talking about things where a parent is abusive or anything like that. We're just talking about, in general, in a normal, reasonably healthy home where, the parents are putting down rules for things that behaviors that they want their children to have, right? Like curfew or doing your homework or cleaning up your room, stuff like that. Hey, little Miss Gloss. So we think about that, right? But then when the child is living in their house and and the parents in many ways are responsible for their child until their child reaches an age of maturity and response, and then it's their child's responsibility to take care of itself and to provide those things for himself. And then, when the child moves out of the house, then he doesn't have to have a curfew or do his homework or anything else like that, right? Or clean up his room. See? So that is in the nature of the exchange. So, what happens if we as adults uh, do that or put ourselves in a situation where we are making somebody else responsible for us, for our livelihood, for other things in our lives? Can we end up getting into a similar situation as that of a child and a parent? And how does that work? And is that healthy? Um, I'm going to say right now, for an adult, that is never healthy. That is something where each of us needs to be, if we want to have, the thing about responsibility is responsibility can be difficult, it can be uncomfortable, but it is also freedom. So when we give over responsibility, oftentimes we are giving over our freedoms as well. So, how does this happen? When we give over responsibility for taking care of us to the state, for instance, we give over our freedoms as well. In a marriage, when a wife gives over responsibility to the husband for taking care of everything and handling everything, then to some extent, is she also giving over her freedoms as well to behave in the way that she wishes? I would say that what I have been trying to determine is there a healthy relationship between responsibility, freedom, partnership, and what is that balance? And that's what I've been trying to look at. Is there a way in which, in a relationship, in a partnership, two people both take responsibility perhaps for different things, but they are not taking away each other's free will, right? They are allowing each other to have free will to make important decisions for themselves, and for decisions that they make together, they do it in harmony, not with one or the other telling the other person that, or trying to control the other person or tell the other person this is how they have to do it, right? Is it possible to have relationships like that that are healthy and harmonious? Or is it the case that whenever you give over responsibility for something, you're also turning over your freedom to make decisions about that thing? This is a question that I'm pondering, right? Because I see it very clearly in all kinds of relationships, right? I see it in a parent-child relationship. We see it in when we talk about the government and the state, right? If they are giving somebody money and they're providing the money to live, then they get to tell you how you're going to use that money, right? So, for instance, when the government provided the EIDL loans, right? When in the CARES Act, the government provided EIDL loans and PPP money, which is the Paycheck Protection Act, and the government told the businesses, this is how you have to spend this money. This is what you need to do with this money. And they were allowed to do that because the government was providing the money. So they were allowed to tell them, this is what you have to do with the money. This is how you have to spend it. So what happens when you're talking about a relationship which is like a marriage relationship or a partnership, perhaps, right? Maybe a business partnership. How does that work? Does it come to a point where one or the other just can tell the other person, well, this is the way it's going to be done because I'm doing this, that, and the other? And I think that's a good question. I haven't quite figured it out yet, but I feel like there is what we might call realms of responsibility, I guess you could say, where, and I've seen this in businesses, right, where there are certain things that all the partners have to agree on together before they make a major change, right? Before they move the company or they change what the company is going to be doing or things like that. Then there's other things like sub areas of responsibility where each partner gets to make decisions in his area of expertise. So for instance, if one partner is good at the marketing and understands that concept, then they're really the ones driving that. They make decisions about what type of advertising and how much gets spent on, the marketing budget, et cetera, et cetera. The other person maybe is focused on the actual manufacturing aspect, and they have their expertise in that. So they make decisions in that realm. And they say, okay, well, this is how we're doing the manufacturing process. We need these pieces of equipment, et cetera, right? And if it's something big, then they come together and talk about it together, right? Like if there's especially a large purchase that has to be made and the funds of the company to be used for that, then they can come together and decide and agree together. And when you're dealing in partnerships like that, when you're dealing in a company and stuff, right, you might have, there's typically is the CEO, right? There typically is one person at the top who makes the final decision if there is a disagreement, right? So how does that play into things? What about having co-CEOs, right? Does that work typically? So these are just all a lot of questions that I am looking at and saying, is it possible to do that or how does one do that when you're thinking about a marriage, a relationship, a business partnership? And then what things are kind of off the table? What are things that are off the table that each individual always should have the ability to make those decisions for themselves and not be told what to do by anybody else, right? So for instance, if you're in a business partnership and you're talking about, the direction of the company or stuff like that, that's one thing. But the other partners cannot tell you what to do about, for instance, your own family or your own therapy, or, how you choose to handle your home gardening, right? Those are realms that are in their individual realm. Doesn't have to do with that part of the business, right? They can't tell you whether or not you can get a piercing, right? Now, they might feel like that could affect the business, but that still is part of um, their choice to do what they want with their own body, mind, right? So now, what about if it is something that clearly affects the business, right? So, for instance, if somebody is an alcoholic, okay, and then that ends up affecting the business, and they end up doing things that are damaging to the business, that might be a realm where it's important to say, hey, what you do on your own time is up to you, but this is now affecting our business, right? This is affecting how you operate in business and your ability to make decisions and so on and so forth. So there can be times when things that are personal end up affecting the whole or the partnership. And when is that appropriate to say something? Hey, Chloe, nice to see you. How are you? Good to see you. So I think these are just some really important questions to think about, because as we think about being in partnership, as we think about dividing up responsibilities, there also is an element of freedom that is involved. And how much does that happen when you turn over responsibility for something to somebody else? Well, how does that affect your freedoms? What freedoms should it impact, and what should it not impact? I think these are some critical questions to look at and to define boundaries around. So just letting you know, these are the kind of questions that are kind of permeating in my mind right now. And who knows where, sometimes if I ponder and think about things, then I can come up with new ways to see them, or ways to clarify or to define it, to define parameters around certain types of things, right? That's kind of what I'm looking for, which is perhaps, are there parameters where we say, okay, or even in a marriage where we say, hey, these things here are kind of each individual's realm, and we shouldn't impinge on them with saying, well, you shouldn't do that thing or the other, right? And there are other things where you say, okay, this is stuff that we need to make decisions on together. And then there might be other realms where you say, hey, that's really your realm and your expertise, so I'll let you make the decision there. And how do we understand and define those different realms? And are they different for different people? But the main thing is really thinking about and understanding that relationship between what we take responsibility for and our freedoms involved in what we're taking responsibility for. Right? So, for instance, we never want to make our partner responsible for our own happiness. Why? Because our emotions, our feelings, they are within the center circle of what I own. I own my body. I own my mind. I own my emotions. I own my feelings. That is the center circle of the framework, right? And so to make somebody else responsible for our feelings or emotions, to say, well, if you do this, then, that makes me angry or upset or whatever, right? Instead of saying, I feel upset because of this and that and the other, but recognizing I'm actually responsible for my own emotion around that. I'm responsible for that. And we can have a discussion about whether or not, that action is something that we want to perpetrate in the relationship, where we say, hey, there's reasons why we think that we should act this way instead of this way for the benefit of, helping the relationship to be good and long lasting, but not just not just because if you do this, it makes me mad. You see, that's not a valid reason to do things, is just to say, this is upsetting. I don't like this, right? It is to say, hey, is this really the best way for our relationship to be on a strong foundation? Are there reasons why we might not choose to do one or the other? Versus it's just, you have to do a certain thing because otherwise I would be upset if you don't. You see, that is putting the responsibility for our happiness on the other person, and it's not their responsibility. And when we stand in judgment of somebody else, right, then we are getting into their business. We are putting our hooks in them and getting into their business when we are in judgment of that. You shouldn't have done that. That was wrong. You shouldn't feel that way. You shouldn't have acted that way to me, right? Anytime you're saying someone should or shouldn't have done or behaved a certain way, that is judging them. And when we judge somebody, we are getting into their business. And that is showing us, and then by doing that, we're letting them put their hooks into us and letting them judge us, right? Which creates this cycle of kind of manipulation and control. So that's what we want to avoid. We want to avoid doing that, because that is making other people wrong or making them responsible for how we feel. That is not standing in our power. That is not being responsible for ourselves and for our own whatever it may be, right? Feelings, wishes, etc. So there's just so much to learn when we're talking about relationships, whether that is a relationship in business or romantic relationship. This is all about relationships. So how do we navigate these sometimes tricky waters is with a lot of guidance, advice, from people who have navigated them before and understand them, and also through understanding what are clear and healthy boundaries. And those boundaries are often just, just even for ourselves, just that individual thing for ourselves, and saying, I'm not going to blame someone else for how I feel emotionally. That is my choice. And I'm not going to stand in judgment of them. And that's really, really hard, really hard to not stand in judgment of someone else, right? But when we do judge them, then we are the one that is getting into their business, right? So that's some of the stuff I'm learning. And so I hope you guys have a beautiful day. And remember to think about this concept of the balance between what is responsibility and freedom, and what are we responsible for and what are others responsible for, right? Of course, we're not talking about, if somebody does something that actually violates your property rights, right? They violate your body, or they steal from you, or they, tell lies about you or whatever. We're not talking about those things. Because those things are obviously and clearly wrong. And when someone does create a violation like that, then it is normal and right to feel a sense of indignation against that. We're talking about things that are, hey, Arshita, good evening, nice to see you. We're talking about things that are more along the lines of, there are more choices in how we choose to operate. They're not a direct violation, but there's so many things. In fact, most of the things that upset us, most of the stuff that we get in judgment about or we get upset about, they are not violations. They are not violations of one of those 4 rings. They're not violations of the body. They're not violations of our creations. and they're not even violations of the deal, right? There may be a sense when we think something should be a certain way, and so we think there's an agreement there, right? Or we think everyone should just, everyone should just know that this is the right way to do it. And that sense of, but there hasn't actually been an agreement, you see? And then that can cause real issues because the other party is like, well, we never agreed about this. We never talked about this. And one party is like, well, this is how it should be done, right? So both parties can end up being judgmental towards the other. And then we're caught in that loop, right? Of making the other person wrong and being in the other person's business in that way, in a way that's not healthy. Thank you for the hearts, Harshita. So how do we step back and look at it and say, was there a violation done, right? If there wasn't a violation done, right? We didn't have a clear agreement about this. It's not a violation of the body or of our creations. Nobody's stealing something from you. Then to sit back and and just say, okay, well, how would we like to do this? How do we want to handle these situations, right? And agree on that and make an agreement, put an agreement in place that both parties then clearly understand what that expectation is and can move forward from that. So that's how I see using the framework to understand some of these things. And I will let you know as I figure out more about, and understand more about some of the distinctions that we can create to help give us more clarity. Using the framework, how do we create distinctions to give us more clarity for how we can act in ways that is balancing that responsibility and freedom, but also is congruent with being true to ourselves and allowing the other person to be true to themselves without judgment. So I hope you have a beautiful day. It was so good to see you, Harshita. So good to see all of you. And I will talk to you tomorrow. And if you guys you like this video, then be sure to hit the like button and send it to other people. If you have comments of how you think about how this works, of how you can think about how do we navigate this type of thing. If you have helpful things, if there are distinctions that you think of, then be sure to put them in the comments because I would love to hear about them. All right, you guys have a great day. Bye.